On a scorching June morning in 1942, deep in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the most powerful naval armada the world had ever seen was about to meet its match. 4 colossal aircraft carriers, their flight decks bristling with warplanes, cut through the azure waters toward a tiny coral atoll called Midway. These were not ordinary ships. These were the very vessels that had delivered the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, commanded by admirals drunk on victory and convinced of their invincibility. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that thousands of miles away in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, a small team of American codebreakers had been listening to their every whispered plan. In just 72 hours, the mightiest carrier force ever assembled would be reduced to twisted metal and flames beneath the Pacific waves. This is the story of how America's underdogs turned the tide of World War II in the span of 3 catastrophic days, sinking not just Japan's ships, but their dreams of empire itself. The year 1942 was Japan's moment of absolute dominance. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the fall of Singapore, from the conquest of the Dutch East Indies to the capture of the Philippines, the rising sun had painted the Pacific red with victory. Japanese admirals gazed at maps, showing their empire stretching across half the world's largest ocean, and they saw not conquest enough, but merely the beginning. The American Pacific Fleet lay crippled at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. British naval power in the east had been shattered. The path to total victory seemed clear and inevitable. At the heart of this unstoppable war machine was the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had become legend in just 6 months of warfare. 6 aircraft carriers sailing in perfect formation, their decks packed with the most advanced fighters and bombers of their time, Zeros that could outmaneuver any Allied fighter, Kate torpedo bombers that could sink battleships with surgical precision, Valdive bombers that could thread the needle through the heaviest anti-aircraft fire. These ships had struck Pearl Harbor like thunder from a clear sky, and now they roamed the Pacific as predators without equal. But success breeds ambition, and ambition breeds overreach. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, stared at the vast Pacific charts spread before him and saw one glaring problem. The American aircraft carriers had escaped Pearl Harbor unscathed. Enterprise and Lexington had been at sea during the attack. Saratoga was undergoing repairs on the west coast. As long as these carriers remained afloat, Japan's Pacific Empire would never be truly secure. They were wolves lurking at the edges of Japan's triumph, waiting for their moment to strike back. The solution, Yamamoto believed, was elegant in its simplicity. Lure the remaining American carriers into a trap where they could be destroyed once and for all. The bait would be Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand, barely visible on most maps, but strategically positioned as America's westernmost outpost in the Central Pacific. Capture Midway, and the Americans would have no choice but to respond with everything they had left. Then the Kido Butai would emerge from concealment and finish what Pearl Harbor had started. The plan that emerged was breathtaking in its scope and complexity. Not content with a simple assault, Yamamoto crafted an elaborate deception involving multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention northward. Meanwhile, the main striking force would approach Midway from the northwest, hidden by weather fronts and the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Invasion barges would follow close behind, ready to seize the atoll once air attacks had neutralized its defenses, and lurking further west, Yamamoto himself would command the combined fleet's battleships, ready to deliver the knockout blow when the American carriers rushed into his carefully laid trap. It was a plan worthy of the man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, intricate as clockwork and devastating in its potential. If successful, it would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific for at least a year, possibly longer. Australia would be cut off from American support. The entire Pacific would become a Japanese lake, with Midway serving as an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which Japan could project power across the Central Pacific for decades to come. But plans, no matter how brilliant, depend on secrecy to succeed. And in the depths of Pearl Harbor, in a cramped basement that smelled of cigarettes and stale coffee, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, and his team of codebreakers were performing miracles that would have seemed impossible just months before. Working around the clock in shifts, these mathematicians and linguists had cracked Japan's most secret naval code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence. Every Japanese radio transmission, every operational order, every strategic discussion was being intercepted, decoded, and translated almost in real time. By late May, the patterns emerging from intercepted Japanese communications painted a clear picture. A massive operation was being planned for early June. Multiple task forces were converging on a target designated by the code letters AF. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, involving virtually the entire combined fleet. But where was AF? The codebreakers were confident it referred to Midway, but they needed proof that would convince Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Pacific Fleet Command. The solution was as brilliant as it was simple. Using the secure underwater cable that connected Pearl Harbor to Midway, Rochefort's team instructed the base to broadcast an uncoded radio message claiming their water purification plant had broken down and they were running short of fresh water. It was a carefully crafted lie, transmitted in the clear where Japanese radio operators would be certain to intercept it. Then came the waiting, tense hours of listening to Japanese radio traffic, searching for any reference to their deception. The confirmation came like a gift from heaven. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was experiencing water shortages. The trap had worked perfectly. Midway was indeed the target, and now Admiral Nimitz knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. The hunters had become the hunted, though they didn't know it yet. But knowing the enemy's plan was only half the battle. The American Pacific Fleet in June 1942 was a shadow of its former strength. 3 aircraft carriers. That was all Nimitz had left in the entire Pacific. Enterprise and Hornet, veterans of the Doolittle raid on Tokyo just weeks before, and Yorktown, limping back to Pearl Harbor with massive damage from the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, her flight deck cratered by Japanese bombs, her hull plates buckled by near misses that had lifted her bodily out of the water. Under normal circumstances, Yorktown would have spent 3 months in dry dock undergoing repairs. But these were not normal circumstances. In an incredible feat of American industrial might and determination, Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers swarmed over the wounded carrier like ants. Working in shifts around the clock, they patched her flight deck with concrete and steel, welded new hull plates over the damaged sections, and restored her to fighting condition in just 72 hours. It was a miracle of engineering and willpower that would prove decisive in the coming battle. As the first days of June 1942 dawned, 2 mighty fleets were converging on a collision course that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. To the northwest, Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai approached with 4 of Japan's finest carriers and the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. To the northeast, 3 American carriers raced toward their appointment with destiny, carrying the hopes of a nation and the determination of men who knew they were fighting for their very survival. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. In just hours, the placid waters around Midway atoll would erupt in flames and fury as carrier-based aircraft clashed in deadly aerial combat thousands of feet above the waves. Neither side knew it yet, but the opening moves of this deadly chess game were already in motion. At 4:30 in the morning on the 4th of June, 1942, the darkness above Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines as the first Japanese strike force lifted off from their carriers. 108 bombers and fighters, their engines synchronized in a symphony of destruction, formed up in the pre-dawn gloom and set course for the tiny atoll that had become the focal point of 2 empires. Leading this aerial armada was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, a veteran pilot whose squadron had perfected their craft over the skies of Pearl Harbor and dozens of other conquered territories. Behind him flew the cream of Japanese naval aviation, 0 fighters that could dance through the air like deadly butterflies, Kate bombers loaded with high explosive and incendiary bombs designed to reduce Midway's installations to smoking rubble. These were not green recruits, but hardened warriors who had swept Allied air forces from the skies across half the Pacific. As the Japanese strike force disappeared into the morning haze, Admiral Nagumo aboard the flagship Akagi allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. His carriers maintained perfect formation, their decks bustling with activity as ground crews prepared the second wave of aircraft. The Americans had no idea what was coming. By noon, Midway would be neutralized, and when the inevitable American carrier response arrived, it would sail directly into the jaws of destruction. But 60 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers were already launching their own aircraft into the pale morning light. Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown and Admiral Spruance commanding Enterprise and Hornet had been waiting for this moment since before dawn. Their search planes had located the Japanese carriers just as the sun crested the horizon, and now every available aircraft was being hurled into the sky in a desperate gamble to strike first. The American pilots climbing toward the clouds that morning knew they were flying toward almost certain death. Their planes were outnumbered, outgunned, and in many cases obsolete compared to the Japanese aircraft they would soon face. The torpedo bombers were death traps, slow and cumbersome, carrying weapons that often failed to explode even when they found their targets. The fighters were too few and too slow to provide adequate protection. But these men had volunteered for a mission that might save their nation, and they flew toward the rising sun with grim determination etched on their faces. At 6:20 that morning, Midway's radar operators watched in fascination and growing horror as a massive blip appeared on their screens, growing larger by the minute. The Japanese strike force was still 30 miles out, but already the atoll's defenders could hear the distant drone of engines, a sound like approaching thunder that grew louder with each passing second. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny islands as every available fighter scrambled to intercept the incoming bombers. What followed was a savage aerial melee that painted the morning sky with smoke and fire. 26 American Wildcat fighters, hopelessly outnumbered but fighting with desperate courage, tore into the Japanese formation. The Zeros, faster and more maneuverable, carved through the American defenders like sharks through a school of fish. Within minutes, most of the Wildcats were falling toward the ocean in flames or spiraling earthward, trailing smoke and debris. But even as Japanese bombs began exploding across Midway's airfields and installations, the American pilots had bought precious time. The base's bombers and torpedo planes, obsolete aircraft flown by men who knew they were probably flying to their deaths, took off from cratered runways and set course for the Japanese carriers. Wave after wave of American aircraft threw themselves at Nagumo's task force in attacks that were heroic in their futility and tragic in their cost. The Devastator torpedo bombers were massacred. Flying straight and level at low altitude to deliver their weapons, they were sitting ducks for the swarming Zeros. One by one they were shot down, their crews disappearing beneath the Pacific waves without scoring a single hit. The dive bombers fared little better, their attacks disrupted by fighter opposition and the violent maneuvering of Japanese ships throwing up walls of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with exploding shells. By mid-morning, it seemed as though the Japanese plan was working to perfection. Midway's airfields were burning, its defenses shattered, its aircraft either destroyed or scattered. The American carrier-based attacks had been beaten off with seemingly minimal damage to the Japanese fleet. Nagumo's carriers sailed serenely through calm seas, their flight decks being prepared for a second strike that would finish off Midway's remaining defenses before the invasion force arrived. But in his moment of triumph, Admiral Nagumo faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short remaining life. The first strike on Midway had been successful, but Lieutenant Tomonaga had radioed back that a second attack would be necessary to completely neutralize the base's defenses. At the same time, Nagumo's scout planes were reporting disturbing news. American ships had been spotted to the northeast, and there were indications that at least one of them might be an aircraft carrier. The Japanese admiral found himself caught between two fires. His aircraft were already armed with land attack bombs for the second strike on Midway. But if American carriers were nearby, those planes would need to be rearmed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed for attacking ships. The process would take at least an hour, during which his carriers would be vulnerable, their flight decks cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines, as ground crews frantically worked to change the weapons loads. Nagumo made his choice. The second strike on Midway would proceed as planned. The American ships could wait. It was a decision born of confidence and adherence to the original plan, but it would prove to be the most catastrophic mistake in Japanese naval history. Even as the order went out to continue preparing for the land attack, American dive bombers were already winging their way toward the Japanese carriers, guided by the smoke and wakes of ships that had nowhere to hide on the empty ocean. The American pilots approaching the Japanese task force that morning were flying a collection of aircraft that seemed almost pathetic compared to the sleek efficiency of their opponents. But they carried something more valuable than superior equipment. They carried the desperate fury of a nation that had been sucker-punched at Pearl Harbor and was finally getting its chance to hit back. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, whose navigation skills and split-second decisions in the next few minutes would change the course of history. McClusky's dive bombers had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, their fuel gauges dropping toward empty, when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed. The ship was the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. But to McClusky, it was a signpost pointing directly toward his target. Banking his formation to follow the destroyer's wake, he led his squadrons toward the most important 5 minutes in the history of naval warfare. At 10:15 that morning, the Japanese carriers presented a sight that would have filled any naval aviator with awe under different circumstances. 4 magnificent ships steaming in perfect formation, their flight decks gleaming in the Pacific sun, surrounded by a protective screen of cruisers and destroyers cutting white wakes through the deep blue water. These were the same carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, their names legendary throughout the Imperial Navy. Akagi, the flagship, her flight deck bustling with activity. Kaga, massive and powerful, her hangar bays packed with aircraft. Soryu and Hiryu, sleek and deadly, their crews confident in their invincibility. But what McClusky saw through his cockpit windscreen was not just 4 enemy ships. It was opportunity itself, served up on a silver platter by the gods of war. The Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible position, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden planking like arteries. Bombs and torpedoes lay stacked in neat rows, waiting to be loaded. Aviation gasoline pooled in puddles that would become lakes of fire at the first spark. Ground crews swarmed over the planes like ants, unaware that death was screaming down toward them from 20,000 feet above. The Japanese lookout spotted the American dive bombers at the last possible moment. Frantic voices crackled over radio circuits as anti-aircraft guns swiveled skyward, their crews knowing they had perhaps 30 seconds to engage targets that were already committed to their attack runs. But 30 seconds is an eternity in aerial combat, and the Americans had caught their enemies with their guard down and their pants around their ankles. McClusky rolled his Dauntless into its dive, the altimeter unwinding like a broken clock as he plummeted toward Kaga's flight deck. Behind him, 36 more dive bombers followed suit, their engines screaming as they built up speed in their deadly descent. The Japanese carriers tried desperately to maneuver, their helms spinning hard over as they attempted to throw off the attacker's aim. But a carrier is not a destroyer, and these massive ships turned with all the agility of city blocks. The first bomb struck Kaga amidships, punching through her flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay below. The explosion was catastrophic, igniting aviation fuel and setting off a chain reaction that tore through the ship like lightning through a powder magazine. Within seconds, the proud carrier was transformed into a floating inferno, her superstructure wreathed in smoke and flame, her crew fighting desperately to save a ship that was already doomed. Akagi, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack, met her fate almost simultaneously. A single 1,000-pound bomb, delivered with surgical precision by Lieutenant Dick Best, struck just aft of the ship's island superstructure. The weapon penetrated the flight deck and exploded among the aircraft waiting to launch, creating a fireball that swept across the ship like the wrath of an angry god. Admiral Nagumo, watching from the bridge, saw his flagship transformed into a blazing wreck in the span of heartbeats. But the Americans were not finished. Even as Akagi and Kaga burned, dive bombers from Yorktown were screaming down towards Soryu, their pilots grimly focused on their bomb sights as anti-aircraft fire burst around them like deadly flowers. 3 direct hits turned the Japanese carrier into a floating torch, her ammunition magazines detonating in explosions that could be felt 20 miles away. The ship that had helped sink Prince of Wales and Repulse was herself sinking beneath the Pacific waves, taking with her decades of naval tradition and hundreds of Japan's finest airmen. In the space of 5 minutes, The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted as dramatically as a tectonic plate. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal, their hangars filled with smoke and flame. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots who had trained for years to perfect their deadly craft, were either dead or swimming in oil-slicked water. The Kido Butai, the mobile striking force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been reduced to a single operational carrier in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. But Hiryu, the lone survivor, was not finished. Captain Tomonaga Kaku, realizing that his ship was now the only hope for salvaging something from the disaster, immediately ordered every available aircraft into the air. If the American carriers could strike with such devastating effect, then by God, the Japanese would return the favor. Within an hour, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters were climbing away from Hiryu's deck, their pilots burning with the desire for vengeance against the Americans who had just destroyed their comrades. The Japanese counterstrike found Yorktown at the worst possible moment. The American carrier was recovering her own aircraft from the morning's attack, her flight deck crowded with planes, taking on fuel and ammunition. When the Japanese bombers appeared overhead, there was no time for elaborate evasive maneuvers, no opportunity to clear the deck of vulnerable aircraft. The ship could only endure what was coming and hope her damage control teams were up to the challenge. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession, their explosions rippling through the ship like hammer blows against an anvil. The first hit aft, destroying the radar equipment and starting fires in the hangar bay. The second struck amidships, penetrating deep into the ship's vitals and knocking out several boiler rooms. The third hit near the island superstructure, killing dozens of men and filling the ship with choking smoke. Within minutes, Yorktown was dead in the water. Her flight operations ceased, her crew fighting desperately to keep their ship afloat. But even as Yorktown burned, her sister carriers Enterprise and Hornet were preparing their own response to Hiryu's attack. The Japanese had revealed their position, and Admiral Spruance was not a man to waste such an opportunity. Every available dive bomber was armed and launched, their pilots carrying with them the accumulated fury of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and a dozen other defeats that had brought America to the brink of disaster in the Pacific. The attack on Hiryu came just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. 24 dauntless dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, found the last Japanese carrier attempting to escape toward the northwest. But there would be no escape from this reckoning. 4 direct hits turned Hiryu into a blazing replica of her sister ships, her flight deck erupting in explosions that sent debris spinning high into the evening air. Captain Kaku, standing on his bridge as flames consumed his ship, faced the same terrible choice that had confronted the commanders of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The proud carrier that had helped bring war to America was dying beneath his feet, her magazines threatening to explode at any moment, her crew abandoning ship in lifeboats and life rafts. The last operational carrier of the Kido Butai was finished, her war over in a single afternoon of violence that had lasted less than 6 hours. As darkness fell over the Pacific on the 4th of June, 1942, the scope of the disaster became clear to the Japanese commanders still alive to comprehend it. 4 aircraft carriers, the backbone of Japan's naval air power, were either sunk or burning wrecks that would have to be scuttled before dawn. With them had died over 250 aircraft and more than 100 irreplaceable pilots, men whose training and experience could never be adequately replaced. The mobile striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been annihilated in a single day of combat, but the Battle of Midway was not yet over. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles to the west, received the catastrophic news with the stoicism of a professional warrior, but his mind was already working on ways to salvage something from the wreckage of his carefully laid plans. The American carriers were still out there, and if he could bring his massive battleships into gun range, perhaps the day could still be saved. The stage was set for the final act of this Pacific drama, as the greatest naval battle of the Second World War prepared to enter its second day with the Japanese desperately seeking revenge, and the Americans determined to finish what they had started in the skies above Midway atoll. And so, in just 3 days of savage combat, the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled had been reduced to twisted metal and ash beneath the Pacific waves. The Midway massacre was complete. 4 Japanese carriers that had terrorized the Pacific lay on the ocean floor, taking with them the dreams of an empire that had stretched too far and reached too high. The pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor were gone, their skills and experience sinking into the depths alongside the ships they had called home. What began as Japan's masterstroke had become their funeral march. The hunters had become the hunted, the predators transformed into prey by a nation that refused to stay down after Pearl Harbor's sucker punch. In 72 hours, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted so completely that Japan would never again threaten American shores or dream of conquest beyond their island fortress. The codebreakers in their basement had given America the gift of foreknowledge. The shipyard workers had given them a miracle in 72 hours. The pilots had given them courage in the face of impossible odds. And together, they had given the world proof that empires built on aggression and sustained by brutality carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. The rising sun had reached its zenith at Midway, and now it would set forever over the dreams of Japanese dominion in the Pacific.